this week is Ameer Abdullah. And if you've been following the news about the Raiders' backfield, Alexander Mattison has an ankle injury, and Zamir White, I believe, has a concussion. Ameer Abdullah is a great pass-catching running back. And I think in this particular game, where I'm suspecting Denver will be blowing out Las Vegas, I'm expecting a lot of targets to go Ameer Abdullah's way. So these are both excellent buy low candidates for me because Josh Jacobs and Aaron Jones have both been on the season top 20 running backs, but have not had a lot of touchdowns. So there's a real world where both of these guys can get more touchdowns as the season goes along. Jones only has 2 on the season, and Jacobs only has 3. So because of that, these are both excellent buy low candidates for positive touchdown regression that's expected for these players. Those are all excellent buy low candidates. Cortland Sutton has a good strength of schedule the rest of the way. Bo Nix is playing well. Cortland Sutton rounds out the top 12 and is a wide receiver 1 the rest of the way.
This be the moment. Jones with the carry. Jones to the end zone. The streak is broken. A Vikings running back has rushed for a second half touchdown.
Jacobs, no shot, barreling forward, touchdown again, number 3 for Jacobs in Green Bay.
36-yard catch and run by Mims, first and goal, next to the air. Caught, Sutton, touchdown! He's done it again! Number 2 today, and the Broncos extend their lead.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Fantasy Football 201. In today's video, we're going to do an early waiver preview of Week 13. We're going to talk pickups, drops, and holds among each of the key positions: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, defense, and kicker. And we're also going to do some start-sit previews for the Thanksgiving Day games and the Black Friday game that will be coming up early this week, so we can kind of get you a little bit of a head start of what guys that you want to play early in your week before the Sunday games. So if you're interested in more content like this, please subscribe to the channel. I reply to all my commenters, and I feature your questions in the show as well. So please take advantage of that with this small channel and ask any questions that you got. All right, so no bye weeks for this week. So we have all the teams coming back this week, and you don't have to listen to my buy or buy instinct segment like you have for some of these past weeks. We only have one more of those this season, so thankfully not too many bye weeks left. But this is an important stretch of the season now with everybody coming back. Some big wins that need to be had to make sure you get into the playoffs. So we will be going through the quarterbacks to pick up first, and then all the other positions from there. So at quarterback, who are the guys that you want to make sure that you get for Week 13? So first of all, check to see if Tua is out there. Tua has played pretty well these past. He kind of started off slow, but especially these last 2 games, he's really found his groove and has vaulted himself into the 2 top 10 quarterback performances, and this week a top 5 quarterback performance. Gets kind of a tough matchup this week against Green Bay, but he does have some favorable matchups to end the season. So check to see if Tua is out there. And then in the deeper league formats, check to see if Caleb Williams is out there too. Caleb Williams has been dropped in a lot of places, and he as well has a tough matchup against Detroit on Thanksgiving. Not somebody that I'm looking to play for this week, but more so a long-term stash, especially in 2 quarterback leagues. Make sure that Caleb Williams is rostered if he's out there. So who are 2 guys that are sneaky plays that could actually be very good finishes the rest of the way? And one of them I've talked about a little bit, and that's Will Levis. So Will Levis, I'll spend some time talking about him. As I mentioned earlier in this show, he has had a very favorable stretch, especially in the fantasy playoffs. I keep talking about in the last 4 weeks of the season, from week 14 to 17 within the fantasy football range of final week of the regular season and then the playoffs. He gets Jacksonville, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and then he gets Jacksonville again, which is about some of the juiciest matchups that you can get at the quarterback position. And Will Levis, although he makes some horrendous mistakes sometimes, evidenced by his pick six. Today he was actually pretty solid aside from the interception. And all the sacks that he took, but that doesn't get counted in fantasy. 18 of 24, 2 touchdowns. He did have that pick. But over the last 3 weeks since he's gotten healthy again, he's put up pretty respectable numbers. 19, 15.6, and then 16.1 this week. And Washington is kind of a tough matchup next week. But then, as I mentioned, he gets that 4-game stretch, Jacksonville, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Jacksonville again. So Will Levis in 2 quarterback leagues must be rostered. But I think there are situations, depending on your other quarterback options, that he could actually be a streaming play in 1 quarterback leagues too that can help you win a championship. And then the other guy to keep an eye on as well, who is very sneaky, but also has played pretty well in his limited time, is Cooper Rush of the Dallas Cowboys. So Cooper Rush, the game, we'll throw out that game against Philadelphia, but over those last 2 weeks against Houston and Washington, he has thrown for 354 yards against Houston, 247 against Washington. He had a 75% completion percentage today, and he had 2 touchdowns. So he had 17.9 points, and then the week prior he had 16.3. He as well has a pretty favorable schedule coming up. He gets the Giants on Thanksgiving, and then he gets Cincinnati, which is a notoriously poor defense that gives up a lot of points to quarterbacks. Then he gets Carolina, and then he gets Tampa Bay. Now, the championship for him is pretty tough. He gets Philadelphia. But that stretch from week 13 to 16 is also excellent. So I bring up both Cooper Rush and Will Levis because these guys are very sneaky ads that have very great schedules the rest of the way that really could help you out. Like, let's say you got Lamar Jackson coming up on his bye week or Jaden Daniels in week 14. These are 2 excellent pivots that you could turn to that could really be beneficial for you in your closing stretch of your fantasy season. Some other guys to take a look at as well based on the matchups for this next week. Bryce Young gets Tampa Bay. And Bryce Young is not anything special, but he has been playing a little bit more respectably as well. Don't like him as much as Cooper Rush or Will Levis, but against Tampa Bay, he's an intriguing option. Drake Maye, a little bit disappointing in this game, but against Miami, but he does get Indianapolis next week, so there's some hope that he can kind of turn things around there. I think that game will really determine how we view Drake Maye moving forward the rest of the season. And then I'm not advocating to pick up this player unless you're really desperate, but Las Vegas now, Gardner Minshew's out for the season, and Desmond Ridder is the starting quarterback. So I do not anticipate Desmond Ridder will be somebody that you want to start ever, but I'm just saying that in 2 quarterback leagues, it's somebody to monitor. And to be honest, I think that based on this situation with the Raiders, you might want to be picking up guys like in the very deep leagues, like Daniel Jones, as I talked about in my last video, just in case they give him a call and say, hey, do you want to be the starting quarterback of the Vegas Raiders? Because he would immediately be the starter. All right, and then another name I want to bring up too for playoff considerations. This player is not somebody that I would be rostering right now because he has tough matchups against Denver and Pittsburgh the next 2 weeks. But Jameis Winston in weeks 15 and 16 has Kansas City and Cincinnati. And Cincinnati is a name we bring up often against fantasy quarterbacks because they are terrible defenses. I've already mentioned this Cincinnati native. This defense is pitiful. But Jameis Winston, he gets Kansas City, which has been a little bit better for quarterbacks as a defense, and then Cincinnati early in the playoffs. So if you're looking at those early rounds, deep league guys to stash that are available, Jameis Winston could be a good pickup in week 16. So who do you want to drop? So Jameis is somebody that I don't think you need to roster right now. He's got Denver and Pittsburgh, unless you're in a situation where you're trying to pick him up to save for the playoffs. But if you're a team that needs to get some wins now, then I think that you could probably part with guys like Jameis because they're not going to really be helping you these next 2 weeks when he's got Denver and Pittsburgh. Derek Carr, he's got a tough matchup this next week upcoming as well. So I think that he's somebody that you want to be dropping and not somebody that you need to feel obliged to hold on to. Geno Smith gets the Jets this next week, which could be a nice matchup, but Geno was a solid pivot option in the early part of the season, but he's kind of regressed a little bit back to the mean, and he's not really giving you top 12 performances anymore. Geno has a pretty tough schedule after the Jets, in which he faces Arizona, Green Bay, Minnesota, and Chicago. So I'm not expecting him to get back to what he was doing earlier this season, where he was putting up close to 18 to 22 points roughly on a week-to-week basis, minus a few duds here and there. I think what we're going to see now is a little bit more of these low-scoring games with Seattle, where Geno will give you a 12 to 15 point week, which is just simply not good enough among some of the quarterback options that you can pivot to. And then deep league drops Gardner Minshew out for the season, and then Brandon Allen, terrible game today, and he showed me that he's not worth not worth starting over a flex. So in a super flex league, so you might as well not roster him. So who do you hold on to among quarterbacks that did not have good week 12s? Anthony Richardson, I would still hold on to him if you can. The upside is great. He gets New England next week, but I think more importantly is just somebody that has the ability like him to rush for 2 touchdowns in a game, to provide mobility like he can. He has too high of a ceiling to just put him to waivers right now. I don't know if I would feel confident starting him necessarily against New England versus some of the other options you have, but he is intriguing enough as a player to hold on to. Russell Wilson had a tough matchup against Cleveland, but he does get Cincinnati this next week. So I think that he becomes another name. See, I keep mentioning Cincinnati because it's a great matchup for quarterbacks, and this is another opportunity for Russell Wilson to step in right away and start again this next week. And then Jared Goff, who had a bad game this week, but he gets Chicago this next week. And I think in general, we've seen the ceiling with Jared Goff and when this offense is humming. And Detroit today kind of had a lot of luck that didn't necessarily break Jared Goff's way. Most of their touchdowns were rushing touchdowns. So because of that, I think that Jared Goff is going to be fine. He just kind of was a victim to the game not exactly breaking his way for today. And then starts and sits for Thursday and Friday. So I'll be going through the 4 games that are coming up. The 3 Thanksgiving games are Detroit and Chicago, Dallas and the Giants. Man, that's going to be a real doozy for Thanksgiving. Miami and Green Bay should be a good game. And then Kansas City and Las Vegas. So among these teams, the quarterbacks that I would be starting and sitting, Jared Goff, I think that he's going to be somewhere within that 12 to 18 range for me. So I think if you're on the fringe, Jared Goff would be an okay start. But if you're looking at one quarterback leagues, I think there are better options you could probably look at later on. Caleb Williams, I would not play against Detroit, although he is intriguing to roster, like I said. Cooper Rush, I think this could be a week that you could play him against the Giants. And I think that Cooper Rush is probably a safer play to me than Caleb Williams because, like I said, they've been successful passing the ball, and the Giants really struggled this past week against Tampa. So I think Cooper Rush should be fine as a streaming option. Again, kind of in that 12 to 15 range, around the same range as Jared Goff. I would probably lean Goff if I had to choose between him and Cooper Rush, but I think that both of them wouldn't surprise me if Rush ends up having a better game than Goff. Miami and Green Bay. So I think that Jordan Love, you're definitely going to play. Tua, if the weather holds up, it's not going to be snowy or windy in Lambeau, I would be comfortable playing Tua again. But if this game right now, the forecast is 22 degrees and no wind, but if inclement weather starts coming in, it's supposed to snow, then I would be sitting Tua because I think that he's had a long documented history of not playing well in inclement weather. How about Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City? He's really turned around his season over the last few weeks, and especially today, finishing as the QB2 on the week. So Mahomes is back in the picture again, and you can play him this week against Vegas. I think this is the time that you can trust him again. It's the first time I've really said that all season, but you can lock him in as your starter this week early against Vegas. Now, Desmond Ridder, no. I think no matter who takes the quarterback position for Vegas, you're not going to be starting them even in 2 quarterback leagues. Unless it's Daniel Jones, but I don't think that's going to happen at this point. All right, so we will move to the running back position. So first of all, check to see if Bucky Irving is available. He may have been dropped on his bye week. Bucky Irving, the number 1 running back on the week. And I had mentioned earlier about how I liked him because Tampa Bay has a very favorable schedule for running backs moving forward. But I honestly was not expecting him to be number 1 on the week. So, well, actually, I say that, and then Saquon Barkley has 46 points. Good grief, man. That is the MVP right there of the fantasy season. Anybody that took Saquon Barkley late first, early second. But Bucky Irving is, you want to make sure that if he's out there, he's 79% rostered in ESPN leagues. So check to see if he is available because that would be easily the number 1 pickup. The number 1 that I would get after Irving, though, is Jaylen Warren. And this is very similar to what I talked about with Irving, and that Warren is a pass-catching running back, and Pittsburgh has the hardest strength of schedule remaining for running backs. But what that means is that instead of relying on Najee Harris to run the ball up the throat, the more productive throat of the defense, that is, Jaylen Warren may be the more productive running back in Pittsburgh moving forward because if they're not having success running the ball, they may use a pass-catching running back more. And that's what happened in this game with Jaylen Warren. He was heavily involved in the Pittsburgh-Cleveland game in the snow. I suspect that he will continue to be a solid running back moving forward. That kind of gives you a very consistent floor around 10 to 15 points. Nothing really special necessarily. But as in the case of this week, Jaylen Warren finished in the top 20, and he gives you a very consistent floor. Since he's been healthy, he's had 7.9, 7.9, 9.5, 10.8, and 15.4. And in all of those games, he's had at least 9 rushes. He's a good change of pace back to Najee Harris. And when they have some tough matchups coming up later in the season, like during the playoffs, they have Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Kansas City. In those specific games, I suspect Jaylen Warren will be a better play than Najee Harris. And I think he will be involved enough that he will give you right around a flex tier to solid bench piece that you can utilize in your flex position or second running back if absolutely necessary. Next on this list, so pay attention to the injury news. These 2 players right now, I'm going to go with Ameer Abdullah first because we've seen him be productive alone today. He was my pickup that was under 40% roster, and if you played him this week, you got a top 10 running back. So Ameer Abdullah, it's very possible with the short week that Alexander Madison and Zamir White will not be ready for this game either. I think there's a better chance that Zamir White will play because usually for a concussion, they're only out for 1 week. But I think that if Ameer Abdullah is going to be the only starter again, I would play him again this week against Kansas City because, as I said in my last video, great pass-catching running back, and I think he will have a very consistent floor, especially because of the quarterback limitations that they'll keep dumping it off to the running back. And Abdullah will be an effective enough play for you to potentially start. And then Jeremy McNichols is the other name I want to bring up because Brian Robinson left with an ankle injury, and then Austin Eckler left with a concussion, which is ironically the same 2 injuries that the Raiders had to their starting running backs. And McNichols has already had a good game this season when he was the second running back. And Washington gets Tennessee, which is a matchup that is usually solid against running backs, but I'm not overly concerned about the ability for McNichols to have a good game should he be the only back. And if he is going to be the only running back in Washington that plays, I would be starting him immediately. So those are the 3 biggest names. The other names I do want to bring up as well, Roschon Johnson, who I've already talked about, is getting more touches in that backfield and is looking more effective. So would be the fourth name that I would make sure to try to roster. And then after that, it's really just making sure to me that you have the handcuffs of your elite players. So as I've talked about many times this season, you want to make sure that if you have Breece Hall, that you have Braylon Allen. If you have Aaron Jones, that you have Cam Akers. If you have Saquon, I don't understand why Gainwell is as lowly rostered as he is, especially when you have a guy that's scoring 46 points in fantasy in Saquon. How can you let his backup just be out there unrostered? So it's crazy to me. But make sure that you get the handcuffs back, especially now that these teams are coming off of a bye. And you're going to be potentially grabbing some of these guys like Allen back, like Herbert back, Khalil Herbert, who didn't play this week. Those are going to be some of the biggest priority pickups, aside from those names that I mentioned earlier that are lightly rostered. Who can you drop? So based on the situation with the Denver Broncos, I think that you could safely drop all these guys. Denver is in a difficult situation for running backs, in which the last 3 weeks it's been a different guy that's been the highest fantasy scoring player. It was Audric Estime 2 weeks ago. Then last week, Javonte Williams took it back from him. And then today, with only 4.4 PPR points, it was Jaleel McLaughlin, who had 7 for 44. So just this whole situation to me screams that it's going to be a mess. Denver also has a bye week in week 14. They get Cleveland next week, which is an okay defense for running backs. But I think in general, I would just be comfortable dropping any of these three, because I just don't think that you're going to get any kind of consistency or comfort with any of them. And I just don't want to play that game of potentially putting in Javonte Williams and then him scoring 2 fantasy points. The Miami running back situation after HN is kind of the same. I like the fact that Jaylen Wright got 7 carries today, but he also fumbled it and finished with 0.4 points. And then Raheem Mostert, who should be dropped if he hasn't already, had another dud. So you can move on from those backups to Achane. And then Jonathan Brooks. So this is an interesting name to mention, but he got 2 carries for 7 yards in his debut. And I think this is the worst possible scenario for everybody that held out their Jonathan Brooks stock for this season. That this is still clearly Chuba Hubbard's backfield. And Jonathan Brooks really only has value at this point if you are the Chuba Hubbard manager. You now have to start treating Chuba Hubbard as if he's a top 15 running back rest of season. And I think it only really makes sense at this point to roster Brooks if you have Hubbard. Who do you hold? So I would not drop Eckler and Brian Robinson, even though they're both injured right now and they have a bye week coming up, if I don't have to, because they're both productive running backs and this team loves to run the ball. There's a chance that either or could play this week and be the starting running back, in which they've both been successful when given that opportunity. So even though they're both injured, I would not drop them. I would not drop Trey Benson either, especially if you were the James Conner manager. Trey Benson had a worse fantasy performance than Amari DiMercato today, so you might be a little bit concerned and think that, like, oh, well, now he's the third running back. And I don't really think that's necessarily the case. I think that Trey Benson is still immensely talented. And this team just has such an identity with running the ball right now that I think that you have to invest the insurance in Benson as the number 2 back should you have Connor. And then Rachaad White, you may be a little bit disappointed by the fact that, Bucky Irving had such a great game and Rachaad White was relatively mediocre with 11.7 points. But I would not really be concerned with that, and I would be trying to keep Rachaad White despite the appearance right now that he is the number 2 running back on this team. So these 3 names are heavily rostered players drafted very high that all had duds this week. Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, and Ramondre Stevenson. So Christian McCaffrey, first of all, I would not be dropping him. I am concerned about him rest of season, though, given that San Francisco without Brock Purdy and Trent Williams just looks like a completely different offense. McCaffrey has no touchdowns. He has only he has only rushed over 40 yards once of his 3 games, and he does not have any touchdowns. So because of that, it's you have to kind of change your expectations that this guy's not really an elite RB1 right now. But that said, that the player itself is just so immensely talented that you have to start him every week. I don't think that you can ever really afford to sit him. Buffalo is concerning, though. So in my rankings, he's not going to be top 10 against Buffalo, but he's just too talented to put on the bench. Now, for these other 2 players, though, that's a different story. Jonathan Taylor has really struggled of late, and he gets a bye week in week 14. So he plays New England next week, which is not really a great matchup per se for running backs. But, the last 4 weeks, he has only gone over 10 fantasy points once. That game, he did have 100 yards and 21 carries. And against the Jets, he had 24 carries 2 weeks ago. But then this week, 11 for 35. So his numbers are trending down. So it's not a great look for Jonathan Taylor. And I think that you're really going to have to make some tough decisions of whether or not you would play Taylor. It's looking right now, if you had a choice between somebody like Bucky, Irving, or Jonathan Taylor, for example, you've got to go with Irving and sit Taylor. And then Ramondre Stevenson. These are the dangers with him that I've been saying all season, is that he looks great when they have the ability to run the ball and let him be the every down back. But when they fall behind like they do today, he's virtually worthless. So, Indianapolis, I think they should be more competitive in that game moving forward. But, they've got some tough matchups to end the season with Buffalo and the Chargers. And I suspect that those games will be blowouts. So, Ramondre, I think you've got to make sure you have pivot options that you can move to at the running back. Who do you want to play for the Thanksgiving and Black Friday games? Detroit, Chicago, Gibson, Montgomery are firing up easily. I would not be playing DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson. We just saw what Jonathan Taylor had happen to him against this team. And I think that because these two are in a timeshare now, and it's an early game and you're kind of burning a spot early with these guys, I would just not do it. Dallas and the Giants. So I think that Dowdle and Tracy are both, flex range players. So Tracy, disappointing game, and he kind of lost the fumble again. So now Devin Singletary's back in the fold. But I think that in general, I think he should be fine to play again. And then Dowdle is getting so much volume, and especially with how the Buccaneers did against the Buccaneers running backs did against the Giants through the air. I think Dowdle should be an effective play. I would choose Dowdle over Tracy if you have both of them. Both of them are going to be kind of around that running back 20 to 30 range for me this week. Achane, you're definitely playing in the Miami Green Bay game, and so is Josh Jacobs, who you're playing as well. Kansas City. So if Kareem Hunt is alone, I would play him. If Isaiah Pacheco comes back, then I would sit both of them, because I think what's going to happen is that they may split the carries up. I would not be playing Isaiah Pacheco regardless, because I think that if he does play against Las Vegas, they're just going to give him minimal touches at best. And then, as I already mentioned, if Ameer Abdullah is going to be alone in this backfield, then I would play him. If not, I would sit all the Raiders running backs. Madison and or Zamir White also come back. Just too much of a timeshare to mess with that. Wide receivers. Who are the wide receivers that you want to pick up for this week? So the 3 names that I want to mention that you should check to see if they're there, and they had great weeks this week, but they may have been dropped in a lot of places. We have Jordan Addison, Jaylen Waddle, and Michael Pittman. These guys have all had up and down performances through the season, so they may have been dropped in different places. So just check if they're out there, because those 3 would be the top 3 ads for sure. But the number 1 ad among the guys that I would get that are lightly rostered, who I've talked about quite a bit already, is Devaughn Vele. And as I mentioned in my under 40% start sit video, Devaughn Vele is getting more involved as the number 2 receiver on this team. And he had his best performance of the season so far. He had 6 for 80 off 9 targets. It's a total of 14 fantasy points, which is his best performance of the season. So as I've already said in the video that came out on Saturday, the last 2 weeks, he had 13 and 10 fantasy points, and he had at least 4 catches in both those games. And then this week to jump all the way to 6 catches, 9 targets, and 80 yards is a big win for him. This guy is only 1% rostered right now in ESPN leagues, 1.7 to be exact. So he's definitely available, and to me, he would be my number one ad among the lightly rostered players because, one, the Denver Broncos offense is getting better, but then two, they have some really nice matchups to close the season, and this is why I'm very high on Sutton, as I mentioned earlier. Cleveland this next week is a great matchup, so I think Vele is in the discussion to play this week potentially. The only reason he's kind of on the fringe is because everybody's back, so there may not be room to put him in. But then in week 15 against Indianapolis, which is a pretty good matchup for wide receivers. And then in week 17, he gets the Cincinnati Bengals, which we've already talked about extensively. So Devaughn Vele to me could be a real sleeper because this team needs a number 2 receiver, and he is stepping up to be that guy. So I would make sure that if he's out there that you grab him. He would be my number 1 ad among these players that are lightly rostered. My number 2 would be David Moore. Moore had a great game this week, and to me, the reason he's not above Vele is because this is kind of feels like a one-game anomaly. Prior to this game, his best performance was against Denver, which was 4 for 39, 5 targets back in week 8. This week against Kansas City, he was 6 for 81 and 1 touchdown off 10 targets. So 10 targets, you can't really argue with that. So you like to hope that there's some trend that could be coming with that, especially since they get Tampa Bay next week. To me, I still like Leggett more than David Moore because Leggett has put more just more consistency of his performances throughout the season than what we've seen from David Moore. But at the same time, Sanders got injured in this game. Thielen is getting older. So as I've talked about with this Panthers team, maybe Moore could be the one that steps up and takes over the number 1 role, which is kind of what happened today. So I'm curious to see if that happens moving forward. And he's not somebody I really would want to play this week, but he is a very intriguing pickup to monitor. After that, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, a guy I mentioned, he just has found a knack for getting into the end zone. And sure enough, he does it again today. This guy now has a total of 6 touchdowns over the last 7 games. So just incredible. And he does it off such minimal volume too. 2 for 48 and 1. So, it's dangerous to chase numbers like that. But at the same time, he's just so hot right now in terms of getting into the end zone that I think you have to keep rolling with him if you're in deep leagues. And in that week 14 bye window, he gets Jacksonville. So this could be a great player to pick up. I don't really like him against Washington, but against Jacksonville, we could be in for a great streaming option with Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. And then 2 other names I want to mention that are teams trying to find a number 2 wide receiver, and these 2 players stepped up this week and are making their case to be that. You've got Tre Tucker of the Las Vegas Raiders, had a solid game today, and then Noah Brown for the Washington Commanders. And it's kind of a similar story for both these guys. They kind of had up and down performances. But this week, Tucker, 7 for 82 off 8 targets. And then Noah Brown today for the Commanders had 6 for 71 on 10 targets. They've both had yo-yo performances, so I'm not super high on both of them, but they're names to monitor because of the situations and the need for the team to have a second receiver that stands out. Calvin Austin to me is interesting, but he only had 3 targets this week. I'd more so be interested in trying to see what happens with Mike Williams once he starts to get more integrated into the playbook, which could happen this next week, since they've had a short week a short week last week and a little bit of a longer week to kind of prepare and get them integrated. Who do you drop? The Packers wide receivers are just a mess. I'll talk about Jaden Reed in a little bit, but I would be dropping Christian Watson and Dontavian Wicks, and honestly, Romeo Doubs probably too at this point. Just when you think you could trust Christian Watson, he does this, and he has 1 carry for 4 yards. It's just no catches, just extremely disappointing. Tyler Lockett has also fallen off the grid, and you could drop him. He had a solid game last week, but this week was just kind of back to bad game again. Alec Pierce, another player who's a yo-yoed. I would just stay away from his archetype of relying on long bomb touchdowns. And then Juju Smith-Schuster is a name as well. He's probably already been dropped by now, but especially since he's gotten back healthy, he's only has 1 catch in the last 2 games. And then Michael Wilson as well. It's looking like with the Cardinals, it's Trey McBride, and then it's Marvin Harrison, and then there's kind of not really much consistency after that you can rely upon. I would hold Josh Downs. Josh Downs struggled in this game, and he's got a shoulder injury now, so we don't really know the extent of that. But when he is healthy, he is the number 1 wide receiver on the Colts, and he has pretty good rapport with Anthony Richardson, so I would not be trying to move on from Downs. Cedric Tillman also got hurt, tough game. I would not be moving on from him either. And then 3 names of players that, I would not be dropping them, but I would probably not be starting them for now. Marvin Harrison Jr., Deebo Samuel, and Jaden Reed. And I think if you have to drop any of these 3 players, the one I would drop would be Deebo Samuel. And he's had a really bad season this year. At least with Reed and Marvin Harrison Jr., they've had some solid games. They've been a little bit up and down, but I think that in general with all 3 of these guys, you're getting very inconsistent play, and it's really killing you on the weeks that you start them. So I'd be looking to find guys that are more consistent to try to plug in as the starter over these 3 players. All right, so Thanksgiving games. For Detroit, I would be starting Amon-Ra St. Brown, obvious. Jameson Williams, I think, is a sit in this game against Chicago. And then among the Chicago receivers, so all of them are very difficult to predict because they all get a lot of targets, but they don't really all perform well. The only one that I'd really feel confident playing is DJ Moore. I think Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze are solid plays if you have to play them, but since everybody's back from their bye week, I'd be looking at options that are playing later. Dallas and the Giants, this one's pretty easy. CeeDee Lamb and Malik Neighbors you play, and then everybody else you sit. There's arguments to be made for guys like Wandale and Jalen Tolbert, but I would personally just rather sit those guys and not use up a spot early on one of those players. Miami and Green Bay. So Green Bay, you're going to sit all the receivers in this game. I think the way it's going right now with the Packers is that you cannot play any of these receivers until, we start to see some better trends in which somebody getting more targets. Jaden Reed is probably the only one that I really want to roster right now. And then for Miami, Tyreek Hill has really struggled this season relative to expectations. I would still play him over Jaylen Waddle just based on what we've seen the majority of the season, despite how Waddle played today. But I think if the weather looks bad, I would just sit all the Dolphins receivers, including Tyreek Hill. Kansas City and Las Vegas, I think this will be a week you could play DeAndre Hopkins and he'll be fine. Jacoby Myers is also a player I would play, but as the case with both these teams, all the other receivers I would sit. Tight ends. So the tight end that I would try to pick up first and foremost if he's out there is Taysom Hill. I think that Taysom Hill has a ton of volume, and there's just a lot of versatility you get with him. He probably was grabbed last week, but just check if he's out there still because he may not have been rostered on his bye week. But the number 1 tight end that you could still get who's likely available in your league is Jonnu Smith. And he's really turned out to be a huge sleeper in November. That's really won people a lot of weeks. And now you got to look at Jonnu Smith as somebody you must start every week, given the inconsistency at the tight end position. And honestly, this may have been his best week that he had on the season. 9 for 87 on 11 targets and a touchdown. That's his season high in catches and targets. I know he didn't have as many points as last week fantasy-wise, but the fact that he's getting 11 targets on this team, and he had 8 the last week, I mean, this is everything that you could have wanted with Jonnu Smith. And now, you could pretty much confidently play him every week. He's a must-start tight end until proven otherwise. And if you go back to that list that I had a couple of weeks ago of how I rank the guys rest of the season, Jonnu Smith is now top 10. So congrats to him for putting himself on the map with these last couple weeks. And then my next one on the list would be Luke Schoonmaker. If Jake Ferguson continues to be out, which is quite possible with the short week coming up, Luke Schoonmaker would be a tight end that I would play right away. He had a touchdown in this game, continues to be decently involved, and I think that against against the Giants, he should be a solid start if you have to play him this week. Next on the list would be Cole Kmet, and there's a pretty clear drop off after Jonnu Smith and Schoonmaker. But Cole Kmet would be the next one that I would look at on this list. 10 targets again. He has up and down performances, but the hope is that they continue to let Caleb Williams throw the ball as much as he does, and that can open up things for the receivers and Cole Kmet. But not a guy I would really want to play unless you're really desperate, especially since they're playing Detroit this week. And then what do you do with Noah Gray, who – last week we said it was an anomaly and he had 2 touchdowns, and then sure enough, he does it again. It's like Britney Spears or something. So that was a terrible joke. But anyway, he has 2 touchdowns the past 2 weeks, and I'd have to crank the numbers on this, but he may have more touchdowns on the season than Sam Laporta, which is just crazy to think about. Let me just look at this, actually. Noah Gray has 4 touchdowns right now. How many does Sam Laporta have on the season? Sam Laporta on the season has 3 touchdowns. So Noah Gray now has more touchdowns on the season than the guy that was drafted number 1 among the tight end this season in the draft. That's just absolutely embarrassing to me. So how do you treat Noah Gray? I honestly kind of view him as somebody that, if you have a Kelsey, you could, and you're in a deep enough league to roster Noah Gray, you could treat him as a handcuff. But I mean, there's just so much inconsistency with his play week to week. But the thing with Kansas City is that you kind of get that across the board with the whole team nowadays. So I'm still not really reading too much into this. I would not be trying to dump Fab to get Noah Gray. But there is an argument to be made against Las Vegas. They're just not playing Kansas City's not playing their cards with their Kelsey packages and letting Noah Gray get more involved. So now he could have another good game against Las Vegas. But I mean, I would not be willing to pay that gamble 3 weeks in a row with him, but I do understand he's really produced well the last 2 weeks. Who do you drop? Pat Freiermuth is droppable. Very mediocre, and I think I would just rather take higher upside with guys like Disley, Jonnu Smith, players like that. Dallas Goedert did not really have a great game today, and that's without Devonta Smith. So when Smith comes back, I'm just thinking Goddard's going to fade out again. You can drop him. Dalton Schultz, bad game again. You can drop him. What do you do with Sam Laporta and Dalton Kincaid? And I think that, if you need to get some wins, I think, as crazy as this sounds, I would rather have Jonnu Smith right now than Sam Laporta. So take that how you want to, but if you just need one tight end on your team and you had to choose between Sam Laporta and Jonnu Smith, I would go with Jonnu Smith. And then who would I hold on to at the tight end? So speaking of Laporta, you still hold on to him if you've got a winning team and you have the space for him. You don't feel like you have to cut him just because he's not doing well. But he's shown a trend of inconsistency this season that I personally would not want to mess with. But if something were to happen to St. Brown or to Jameson Williams, then Laporta becomes a featured option again. But you're really right now almost treating him as a handcuff to the receivers more so than a tight end that you want to plug and play every week. I would not drop Cade Otton either. He had a down game, but I do think that he's still going to be the second wide receiver on this team in games that are going to be more competitive than this one. Jake Ferguson, I would not drop either because I think that he will continue to be more involved when he gets healthy. And then David Njoku, I would not drop off of this bad game in the snow. He dropped a touchdown, so his numbers could have been better, but also he's still pretty involved on this team. And aside from the snow game, prior to that, he was getting 7 targets at least the last 5 games. So because of that, I would continue to hold David Njoku, and I think you could plug him in as a starter even against Denver. In the Thanksgiving matchups, I would sit both Laporta and Kmet this week. I would not feel confident playing either of them. I would try to get somebody else in my lineup. Among the Dallas Giants game, Theo Johnson, you're not playing of the Giants. But then Dallas, whoever is going to be the starter, whether it's Jake Ferguson or Luke Schoonmaker, I would play them in this game. And yes, I would even play them over Sam Laporta. Miami and Green Bay, Jonnu Smith, you're playing him. And then Tucker Kraft, I would not be trying to play him because he's very touchdown dependent. And because of that, I would not be trying to roll the dice again and risk getting a 0, especially with the game on Thursday. I would leave Tucker Kraft out of my lineups. Travis Kelce, I would play. I would not play Noah Gray, despite the fact that it may be tempting. And then Brock Bowers, you could put him back in. Surprisingly, a bad game this week, but I think he'll be totally fine. I'm not really worried about him long term. All right, so we will move to the defenses. And I want to let you know that I have more information about the defenses that you want to pick up in the last video that I made on Saturday, which talks all the defensive stream matchups that you want to look at for the playoffs. But I will point out for this upcoming week 13, some very intriguing matchups and probably the best defensive plays you can get that are all possibly still available in your league. Kansas City gets Las Vegas. We have no idea who their quarterback is going to be. And Kansas City's defense has not been statistically good. So if they get dropped, I think they'd be a great pickup and play. Tampa Bay gets Carolina. I've already talked about their schedule. You could see that in the last video. And then Houston, who's been one of the best performing defenses the last 2 weeks. It gets even better because they get the Jacksonville Jaguars, which potentially will be playing Mac Jones. Other than that, look at the Seattle defense, which gets the New York Jets this week. I think Seattle's defense has really played well the last 2 weeks, and they get a nice matchup that I think you can plug and play them again. And then, also the Dallas Cowboys against the Giants is an intriguing defense too. They had a good performance this week, but a lot of that was special teams. And then the Colts against New England is another defense to look at as well. Who would you drop? So, in some cases you got to let, history pass you by, and you got to drop the San Francisco 49ers defense. They are just not the same. They put up negative points against Green Bay this week. And, they have talented players, but with Nick Bosa being injured right now, and the thing is with this defense is that they really have no get-right games moving forward. They have Buffalo, Chicago, which, you could argue that's their get-right game if they were to create turnovers, but they've been a little better of late with the OC change. Then they get the Rams, then they get Miami, and then in the championship they get Detroit. So I don't see a clear path to this defense, becoming a great start rest of season. So because of that, if you have them, I would be looking to pivot at this point and not hold on to the 49ers defense. And then kickers, one of my favorite segments of the week, as you guys know. So we've seen a lot of poor kicking play the last 2 weeks, and some of that's contributed to weather, but I think in general, I think the way you have to look at this is just as I've always been saying, that you cannot be attached to kickers in fantasy football because, some of them do really well from a certain period of time. Like Justin Tucker was so reliable for years, but he's really struggled this season, especially as of late. Brandon Aubrey has not put up the monster numbers that he has in years past. And that he has earlier this season and last year, with some of the offensive limitations and missed some field goals today. Austin Seibert, who was great early on, had some horrible misses, and I can't believe he missed that extra point. That was just crazy to me. So the thing that I want to say is that there's only 4 kickers right now that I feel like you have to roster. And then for the others, I would be willing to drop one from time to time to, pick up somebody like an Ameer Abdullah, see if he ends up getting the start, or a Jeremy McNichols, see if they get the start. The other kickers I'd be trying to drop most of them to kind of let situations like that play out, because ultimately you can replicate any of these guys' performances from anybody on waivers that's available. Like, look at the top 3 kickers on the week. 29% rostered, 3% rostered, and 2.5% rostered. Will Lutz, Nick Folk, and Daniel Carlson. So because of that, you could find top kicking performances on waivers every single week. I would not be attached to your kickers. The only ones that I would be keeping, Brandon Aubrey, because, he at the end of the day, he had kind of a tough week this week. Not a great week the last week either. But he's still one of the best kickers in the league. He's always a threat to kick it from 60. So because of that, I wouldn't be dropping him, especially since they play in a dome. Jake Bates, same way. He doesn't have the elite upside because they score so many touchdowns, but Jake Bates is still an excellent kicker that I would be trying to keep with that Detroit offense. Kaimi Fairbairn, again, a dome kicker that has a good leg, but again, just missed a completely inexplicable field goal today that cost them the game, basically. And then Chris Boswell, because the Steelers' offense has limitations and needs to rely on him for kicking field goals, and he typically converts pretty effectively. Aside from those 4 kickers, you do not need to be rostering the other kickers and holding them through your week. If you are in a position where you don't know which of your guys to drop, and yes, this even includes Justin Tucker, because he has a bye week in week 14, and I'm for one going to tell you, like, I'm not going to be holding him through his bye week. So if you see one of these guys that I mentioned, like a Jaylen Warren or a Devaughn Vele, guys that you're trying to take a flyer on and see what happens, I would try to hold them at least through the week, and then when you get to Saturday or Sunday, if one of your guys gets injured and you got to put him on IR, or if you're going to drop somebody, just wait until Saturday, because 1, you're blocking your opponents from getting that player, and 2, you're going to find that kicking production somewhere on waivers that you can replicate what you would have gotten from the guy that you had held through the week anyway. So it serves 2 purposes for you and really expands your options, that it's extremely beneficial at this point of the season. And speaking of which, for Thanksgiving, so there's 3 kickers I would play for this week. The other ones I would drop, so that way you give yourself some options of guys to play. So I would be playing Brandon Aubrey, I'd play Jake Bates, and I'd play Spencer Schrader of the Chiefs. Those are all kickers that I would play for this early game slate in week 13. But, like, for example, guys on the fringe like Jason Sanders, Brandon McManus, I do not think it would be worth rostering them, because you want to hold out for that Jeremy McNichols, see if Austin Eckler or Brian Robinson are going to play. If you use that kicker spot early, to me, it's not really benefiting you, especially in that Green Bay game, because they could have inclement weather. We never know how those guys are going to kick with their snow. That's a blizzard there. Just look at the game last Thursday. So because of that, I would not be even rostering the other kickers in this Thursday game, other than those 3 that I mentioned, because then you could expand your options more to see what happens if one of these guys on the fringe, like McNichols, Abdullah, if they get the starting nod again, then you can feel confident to plug them in. Just gives you more options, and it's a good way to keep yourself open for different things that you could do to set your team up for success, get these last few wins for the season. All right, well, that's all that I've got. Drop any comments or questions that you have below about your lineups, and I will get to you as soon as I can. I'm anticipating having a video coming out probably Saturday, but may do a live as well on Sunday. So please comment and let me know how you'd like it to go for this week. If you'd like to have another live video, or if you just want to do a pre-recorded video. And hope you guys have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you guys next week.